I'm a real estate broker in Quingbra, and last week, this couple from Phoenix walked into my office insisting they needed to view properties by 9 a.m. sharp, because that's when business hours start everywhere. I explained we open at 10. The wife looked at her watch, looked at me, then back at her watch and said, "But it's already past business hours in Arizona. So technically we're late." She'd calculated the time zones backward and decided Portugal was somehow obligated to match American schedules. Her husband nodded seriously and mentioned they'd also need the property titles verified by the Better Business Bureau. We don't have that here. When I explained Portuguese real estate law, he interrupted to inform me that consumer protections are universal and cited something called the Federal Housing Act. That's American legislation. I showed them 3 beautiful apartments anyway, and at each one they asked where the central air conditioning controls were. I kept saying, "We don't really use central AC." They kept searching for vents. Meanwhile, in Guadalajara, I worked the reception desk at a boutique hotel, and this American checked in demanding to know our earthquake protocol. We're not in a seismic zone. He insisted everywhere in Mexico has earthquakes because he'd read about the 1985 Mexico City disaster and assumed the entire country experiences monthly tremors. He'd brought an earthquake survival kit with 3 days of freeze-dried meals and wanted to store it in our safe. Then he asked if our bottled water was FDA-approved. My cousin manages a bakery in Sintra, and she watched an American woman pick up a pastel de nata, examine it from every angle, then ask if it was gluten-free, sugar-free, and made with oat milk. When my cousin explained it's custard, eggs and pastry, the woman said, "Right. But the Portuguese version must be healthier because Europeans don't have processed foods." She bought 6 anyway, and mentioned they'd be perfect for her keto. DIETI run a visa consultancy office in Lisbon. And this tech worker from Seattle came in absolutely convinced Portugal has a lottery system for residency. Visas like America's green card program. I explained, we have the D7 passive income visa with specific financial requirements. He said, No, I read online there's a waiting list. So logically there must be a lottery, because that's how fair systems work. I showed him the official documentation. He pulled out his phone and started showing me Reddit threads as counter-evidence. When I walked him through the actual application process, he stopped me and said he'd already filled out forms he'd found on some blog and just needed me to submit them to the Department of Immigration. We don't have a Department of Immigration. We have AMA. He insisted those were just regional names for the same federal agency, and asked for the Portuguese equivalent of a green card. That would be a residence permit, which looks completely different. He'd brought photos sized for American passports. Wrong dimensions entirely. My sister works at a bank in Playa del Carmen. She had this couple from Dallas who wanted to open an account and demanded to speak with the FDIC representative. She explained Mexican banks are regulated by CNBV. Not FDIC, the husband said, that's probably just the regional branch name. But the federal insurance is the same across North America because of NAFTA. I said his wife nodded and added that they specifically chose Mexico because they'd heard the FDIC insurance limits were higher here. They'd somehow confused trade agreements with banking regulations. When my sister mentioned the 400,000 peso insurance limit, they converted it to dollars, realized it was only about 23,000, and the husband declared there must be a mistake in the exchange rate calculator because no modern country would have such low protection. He suggested we were using old pesos. I teach at a language school in Porto. Damn, we get Americans enrolled in Portuguese classes who show up insisting they're already fluent from years of high school Spanish. This one guy from Miami interrupted our 3rd session to correct my pronunciation, explaining that in proper Portuguese, you should be able to understand it if you know Spanish, because they're basically the same language, just with an accent. I'm literally from Braga. When I tried to explain the grammatical differences between ser and estar in Portuguese versus Spanish, he said, "But that's probably just formal versus informal, right? Like how British English has more rules than American English." He'd convinced himself Portuguese was just Spanish pronounced with a French accent. Another student asked if we could skip the part about nasal vowels because those don't exist in Spanish and must be optional pronunciation flourishes. I spent 15 minutes explaining that bo is fundamental to Portuguese. She insisted it sounded decorative. My brother manages a medical clinic in Merida, and this American woman came in for a routine checkup and brought her entire medical history from the United States, which was great. What wasn't great was when she asked which insurance network we belonged to and wanted to know our relationship with Blue Cross Blue Shield, or private pay, or Mexican insurance. She said, right. But for billing purposes, which American insurance consortium is your parent company affiliated with? She'd assumed all healthcare globally connects back to American insurance networks. When I explained she'd need to pay and then file for reimbursement herself, she asked where our billing department was so she could speak to them about setting up an in-network exception. She mentioned she'd done this successfully at a resort in Cancun, not understanding that hotel doctor visits work differently from actual medical clinics. Then she asked if our doctors were board certified by the American Medical Association. I'm a waiter at a traditional Portuguese restaurant in Casca. This American family came in for dinner at 6:30 p.m. demanding a table. We don't open until 7:30. The father checked his watch and said, "But you're losing the dinner rush." I explained Portuguese people eat later. He insisted this was probably just a rural tradition that modern Portuguese cities had moved away from because of globalization and the influence of international business hours. He'd read an article about Lisbon's startup scene and concluded this meant Portugal had adopted American meal schedules. They waited in their rental car for an hour, then came back and asked why the kitchen wasn't offering any early bird specials since they'd been so patient. When I brought bread and olives to their table, standard Portuguese starters, the mother asked if these were free and seemed suspicious when I said yes. She'd heard about European scams where restaurants charge for everything and wanted to confirm we wouldn't add them to the bill. Her teenage daughter ordered a salad and asked if we could make it entree-sized. Because in America, salads can be full meals. I brought her our normal-sized salad. She said, "This is an appetizer portion." It was a full Portuguese salad. My uncle owns a taqueria in Oaxaca, and he had this couple from Oregon order tacos and immediately ask for plates, napkins, and silverware. Real tacos are eaten with your hands using the tortilla. The woman looked horrified and asked if we had sanitary concerns about hand-to-food contact. My uncle explained this is traditional. The husband said, "I totally respect cultural authenticity. But what's your policy on utensils for people with dietary restrictions?" He didn't have dietary restrictions. He just wanted a fork and knife. When my uncle brought their order, they asked why the meat was in small pieces instead of ground beef, and where the hard shells were. My uncle explained these are authentic tacos. The wife said, "Right, but we wanted Mexican tacos, not Spanish tacos." Oaxaca is in Mexico. They'd confused Spanish food with Mexican food and assumed anything not matching Taco Bell was European influence. Then they asked if we could melt some cheese on top because they'd read that authentic Mexican tacos always have melted cheese. My uncle makes tacos the way his grandmother taught him. They have crema and salsa, not melted cheddar. I work at a cafe in Lisbon's Chiado district. And this American woman ordered a coffee, which in Portugal means an espresso. She took one sip and said, "This is a mistake. I ordered coffee, not a shot." I explained this is how coffee is served here. She insisted there must be regular coffee available and that espresso was just the premium option. When I offered her an Americano, she got excited and said, "Perfect. That's the normal one." She took a sip and said it tasted watered down, then asked if I'd mixed it wrong. An Americano is espresso with water. She'd expected it to taste like drip coffee from a machine. Then she asked if we had any flavored syrups, and when I said no, she mentioned that Starbucks is an American company, so we should probably carry the same products to stay competitive in the European market. She'd assumed Starbucks represented universal coffee standards. My friend works at a market in San Miguel de Allende, and she watched this American man try to haggle over the price of pottery by saying, "But this is Mexico, so everything should be negotiable, right?" The prices were already fair. He'd brought a printout from a travel blog titled "How to Bargain Like a Local," and was reading tips out loud while the vendor stood there. The vendor said the price was fixed. The American said, "Come on, I know that's part of the dance. You say fixed, I offer half. We meet in the middle." The vendor repeated the price. The American accused him of not wanting to engage in cultural traditions and mentioned that when he'd visited Morocco, he'd successfully haggled everywhere. So clearly all non-Western countries operate the same way. He offered 60% of the asking price and called it his final offer. The vendor shrugged and sold the piece to someone else at full price. The American seemed genuinely shocked. I drive a taxi in Porto, and this American tourist got in and asked me to take him to downtown Portugal. I asked which city he meant. He said, "You know, the main downtown area where everything is?" I explained Portugal is a country with multiple cities. He said, "Right, but there's always one central district where the government buildings and main restaurants are. Like how Washington, D.C. is America's downtown." He'd confused capital cities with downtown districts and assumed Lisbon was just the name of Portugal's downtown area, the way Manhattan is New York's downtown. When I explained Lisbon is a separate city to ours south, he asked why Portuguese infrastructure was so spread out and suggested we should consolidate for efficiency. My cousin works at a train station. And this American couple wanted tickets to Mexico City, but insisted on knowing which state Mexico City was in so they could plan their route. When she said it's the capital, they asked, "But which state?" She explained Mexico City is its own entity. The husband said, "That doesn't make sense. Capitals are always inside states. Like Washington, D.C. is in Virginia. Washington, D.C. isn't in Virginia." They'd misunderstood American geography and applied it to Mexico. The wife pulled up Google Maps and said, "See? It says Mexico City, Mexico. So the first Mexico must be the state, and the second Mexico is the country." They asked if the train would cross any state lines and whether they needed additional documentation for interstate travel within Mexico. I rent cars at the Faro airport, and this American businessman asked for a vehicle with the steering wheel on the normal side, because he'd heard Portugal still uses British-style driving. I explained we drive on the right side of the road with left-side steering wheels, same as America. He said, "But you're in Europe, and I thought Europe was all British-style." I mentioned that most of Europe drives on the right. He asked if we had any American-style cars with miles-per-hour speedometers because kilometers would be too confusing. When I showed him a car with a digital speedometer that displays both, he asked if it would automatically convert to miles once he crossed into Spain, assuming the car would detect the border and switch units. Then he requested an easy pass for the tolls and seemed confused when I explained Portugal uses a different electronic payment system. He'd assumed European highway technology was unified under one system, like America's Easy Pass Consortium. My niece works at a pharmacy in Guadalajara, and this American woman came in with a prescription from her doctor in Arizona asking us to fill it. Mexican pharmacies can't fill American prescriptions without a Mexican doctor reviewing them. She said, "But it's from a licensed physician, so it should be valid anywhere in North America because of the trade agreements." She'd conflated AFTA with medical licensing reciprocity. When my niece explained she'd need to see a Mexican doctor, the woman asked if our doctors could just rubber stamp her American prescription since the medications are the same. The medications might not be the same. Different countries approve different formulations. She insisted this was bureaucratic inefficiency and mentioned that when she'd bought medication in Canada, they'd honored her American prescription. Canada has different pharmaceutical agreements. She asked if there was an expedited process for American citizens, because surely U.S.-Mexico relations included healthcare provisions. I teach English in Coimbra, and I had this American student who kept correcting my British English spellings, insisting that color and honor were mistakes. I'm Portuguese, but trained in British English, which is standard here. He said, "I get that you learned English as a second language, so you probably learned the old-fashioned way. But American English is the modern version that everyone's switching to." He'd convinced himself American spellings represented linguistic evolution rather than regional variation. When I explained that Portugal's English education follows British standards, he suggested this was probably because our textbooks were outdated and offered to bring me some American grammar guides to help modernize the curriculum. Another student asked why I pronounced schedule with a soft sound instead of a hard SK sound, and when I explained that's the British pronunciation, she said it sounded wrong because she'd never heard it before. therefore it must be incorrect. She'd assumed her experience represented the universal standard. I manage a hotel in Lagos. Last month I had this couple from Denver check out after a week-long stay. They'd spent the entire time being baffled by Portugal. As they loaded their luggage, the husband turned to me and said, "You know, you guys should really consider joining the US. You'd get better infrastructure, everyone would learn English, and you could fix all these little inefficiencies." His wife nodded and added that they'd love to retire here once Portugal became more Americanized. I smiled and wished them a safe flight. My brother in Tulum had a similar experience with Americans, suggesting Mexico should adopt the dollar to make things easier for tourists. These folks moved to new countries, expecting the countries to change for them rather than the other way around. The irony is, they came here seeking something different from America, but they want that difference to come with American conveniences, American systems, and American standards. They want cheaper healthcare that works exactly like American insurance. They want better weather that still includes American mealtimes. They want cultural authenticity that's been standardized for American comfort. I'm not complaining. These stories keep us entertained at family dinners, and honestly, most expats eventually figure it out and integrate beautifully. But those first few months, pure comedy.